All right, y'all, this lecture is about the Spanish-American War in 1898. Besides being an age of important domestic reform, the Progressive Era witnessed the emergence of the United States as a great power on the world stage. Your essential question is, how did the Spanish-American War mark a turning point in American history? First, let's talk a little bit about foreign policy. Um, Foreign policy refers to a country's policies toward other countries. Social scientists believe that there are certain characteristics that make foreign policy so special. These are 5 of those characteristics. First, international anarchy. Each independent sovereign nation has its own laws that citizens must obey. If citizens fail to obey these laws, they can be punished. Sovereign countries, however, are not subject to such higher laws. For this reason, social scientists say that sovereign nations exist in a system of international anarchy. Each nation must depend on its own military and economic power to survive. On the other hand, countries usually follow some rules and customs to get along with everybody else. Second, a balance of power. When one country becomes too powerful, other countries sometimes band together in an alliance or coalition to protect themselves and make sure the threatening power does not become any stronger. This tendency is known as maintaining the balance of power. Third, control of U.S. foreign policy. In the United States, the Constitution places control of foreign policy in the hands of both the President and Congress. While the President and Secretary of State handle day-to-day diplomacy, they need Congress to vote funds to support their policies or to declare war. Fourth, traditional foreign policy. For much of their early history, Americans felt safe behind their 2 oceans. These oceans protected Americans from attack. President Washington had warned Americans to avoid entanglements with European nations who were frequently at war with each other. Instead, he advised Americans to focus on the Western Hemisphere. For the first 150 years after independence, Americans largely followed Washington's advice. And finally, fifth, national interests. In the conduct of foreign policy, each nation is usually guided by its national interests. For the United States, these include security from attack, protecting American investments, and promoting American democracy and its way of life. To evaluate a particular foreign policy, you must determine how well it promotes these goals. All right, the origins of the Spanish-American War. Once the greatest of all world empires, by 1890, Spain's overseas empire had been reduced to Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and a few smaller islands. Most Cubans were peasants and laborers working on sugar and tobacco plantations. In 1894, the United States raised its tariff on foreign sugar. This made it harder for Cuba to export its sugar, leading to unemployment. Cuban exiles in the United States, led by Jose Marti, sailed home and declared Cuban independence in 1895. Spain responded by sending a Spanish army to Cuba to crush the rebellion. They used brutal methods to repress the uprising. To isolate the rebels, entire villages were forced into camps surrounded by barbed wire, where many died of disease and starvation. These events raised humanitarian concerns in the United States. They were reported in newspapers like Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. These newspapers deliberately sensationalized the news, depicting the Spaniards as murderous brutes in order to sell more newspapers. This technique became known as yellow journalism. Their unbalanced reporting increased their circulations but gave Americans an inaccurate picture of events in Cuba. Americans were also concerned to protect their investments and trade with Cuba. Events that triggered the war. In early 1898, a letter by Delome, the Spanish ambassador, was published in newspapers in the United States. This Delome letter outraged Americans by calling President McKinley weak. Shortly afterward, the USS Maine was sent to Cuba to protect the lives and property of all Americans. While it was moored in Havana Harbor, it was sunk by an explosion that killed 258 U.S. sailors and injured many others. Although the cause of the explosion remains unknown, the Hearst and Pulitzer newspapers blamed the Spanish for sabotage. The sinking of the Maine set off a firestorm of protests in the United States. The Spanish government was willing to halt its fighting against the Cuban rebels even to open the camps of Cuban prisoners, but refused to grant Cuba its independence. The war breaks out. The Spanish-American War was fought on 2 fronts, both in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. Shortly after the start of the war, the U.S. Pacific Fleet sailed to the Philippines to aid Filipino rebels already in revolt against Spain. The Navy defeated a squadron of Spanish ships in Manila Bay. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt raised a volunteer force known as the Rough Riders. Acting with other Army regiments, they defeated Spanish forces at San Juan Hill in Cuba. The U.S. Navy also took Guantanamo Bay. Nevertheless, some U.S. Army troops had to withdraw from Cuba because they were contracting yellow fever. Other forces occupied Guam and Puerto Rico. Within 4 short months, Spain was defeated. American forces were left in occupation of the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam. The Spanish-American War as a turning point. The Spanish-American War marked the end of Spain's colonial empire and the emergence of the United States as a world power. The war had let the United States demonstrate its naval strength to the world. It also raised a critical issue for Americans. What should the United States do with the former Spanish colonies it was now occupying? Many historians see the war as a turning point because the United States had awakened to its potential as a world power.